So, hello everyone. Welcome to this episode of the About Time podcast with me, Chris Nichols. This is part of my 65th birthday series, and it's a series in which I'm having the great fortune to have conversations with people whose work has inspired me over the years and inspires me now, and the work that I think I just want people to know about. And one of the people I really want the world to know about is my guest today, and that's Phoebe Tickell. Phoebe, I'm delighted that you're here.
I'm so delighted. I'm so honored to be one of your 65th birthday podcast guests, calling in from the RSA Centre of London, and super excited for this conversation, Chris.
And I'm so delighted that you're in RSA House because I've been an RSA fellow for a long time and I love the place. And because I live so far away, I don't get in that often. So it's nice to, it's been
Vicariously.
jazzed up since I was there last. I did see the renovations. They're brilliant. So
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah, good.
I mean, I love the work you do. You are like
Thank
a
you.
creative, scientific, ecological, planet transforming dynamo. I mean, how do we start describing you? I mean, how do you describe yourself to people? What do you do?
You are too kind. That's a lovely. I feel like I'll have to snap that for future introductions. I usually introduce myself as a scientist to start with, scientist, a systems thinker, and sometimes I describe myself now as an imagination activist and the founder of Moral Imaginations. But planetary dynamo has a much better ring to it. But planetary steward, which I think all of us need to be using in these times. But those are some things to describe me.
Yeah. Now, I want to know something about the history of how you come to be that, but let's just start really parochially by how did we meet? And I think it was Schumacher. Um,
I think it was when Schumacher College. So for people who aren't familiar with Schumacher, this is a deep ecology sustainability postgraduate university, which sadly has, at least in its place-based form, recently shut down. But it was running for, I think, 28 years. It must have been around that, because I remember celebrating the 25th birthday, and it was based in Devon, and has had thousands of brilliant people who now work in places like the UN and government and activists in communities, pass through and go through the kind of Schumacher experience.
yeah.
Um,
And what?
so we met,
Yeah,
yeah, we met when Schumacher was going through
yeah,
major changes, as it was, a lot of the time, because it was constantly adapting and flexing to the times.
yeah.
And
How did you end? How did you come into contact with it? And what were you doing there?
yeah, so I had just left my post as a research assistant, and I just research assistant and then PhD. So I was just starting a PhD over in California at the Scripps Institute in Marine Biotechnology, and finally decided to leave science, at least for a year. That was my decision, was to actually give a bit of time and space to explore this sense I was having that something else was needed, a different sort of response to the crises that I could see, especially the climate crisis. Um, and so I took the year to explore different options, and Schumacher College was one of the places where I was based at, and was given space and time and sort of support to research and develop different teaching methods. So I was an associate lecturer and worked with Stefan Harding, who founded something called the Holistic Science Masters, the MSc, and was also one of the kind of core founders of the college. And so I worked with Stefan, in his work to redesign the masters and bring updated science and different methods to the teaching. So that's how
Brilliant.
I ended up there. Yeah, it was
I,
kind of the beginning of the work I do now.
yeah. So by that point, I had probably stopped teaching at Schumacher, although I taught on that master's degree
Mm,
really alongside Brian Goodwin, and then alongside Phil Francis, and then alongside
mm,
for a while, and dipped into teaching on the other ones. It was a marvelous place. I'm just devastated that it's not there anymore, and it's appeared in a new form as Schumacher Wild, and who knows what
mm,
things may come. But
mm.
um, So we met there, and that was probably, I don't know, just before COVID anyway. Some
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and you didn't have moral imaginations at that time. So
No.
so how did you come into the work you do now? Probably this would be a great time to say something about what you
What
do.
is that?
So exciting, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Moral Imaginations is an organization that is pioneering imagination as a form of systems change and activism. So, as an approach to changing organizations, culture, and the systems that we swim within. So, we recognize that if you can't imagine a different system, if you can't imagine the world differently, you can't create it. So, imagination comes upstream of all new models, all new frameworks, and all sorts of societal change. So that's moral imaginations. And the term moral imagination, which obviously is in our name, is a 300-year-old term, which has been used over the last three centuries in different forms. Firstly, by somebody called Edmund Burke, a statesman, and very much used the term in the context of democracy and civic renewal, and then others such as John Paul Lederach more recently use moral imagination in the context of peace studies and bridging conflict. But the way we're using this term is a revival. So we're reviving the term for the 21st century in the context of the poly crisis and the climate crisis. And what we are bringing to the work and the term and this lineage of moral imagination that's different is the perspective of needing to stretch our imaginations to think long term, to include future generations in our circle of concern, and stretch our imagination also, if you think of that as stretching it forwards in time, also stretching it back in time to appreciate where we've come from, what are the historical and systemic inequities that have led to the system that we now find ourselves in. So rather than being in a contextless, sort of perpetual present, appreciating where we've come from, connecting also with ancestry, and so that stretching backwards in time, and then also stretching sideways in a sense. So a lot of our systems are incredibly anthropocentric, meaning human centric. We have design disciplines which are based around human centered design or user centered design, when actually human beings are one of tens of sorry, I was going to say tens of thousands of species in England, but obviously millions of species worldwide. So the last piece is really stretching our understanding of who is included in the systems we design. So that's, in a nutshell, a bit about moral imagination and what that term means. And now we've worked with over 50 organizations and trained around 1,000 individuals in this methodology that we've developed. This moral imaginations methodology
Is brilliant because that's grown a lot from even our most recent conversation about it a year or two ago. So
Yes.
you've done huge amounts more. So what
Yes.
I mean, without breaching any confidentialities, I mean, what kind of clients are interested in this, and what does Phoebe? Why do people, when Phoebe's phone rings, what do they say? Does they we want to embrace our ancestors, or I mean, how do they do it? What do they call you up for?
Often people have either seen one of our projects or heard me speak, and want to kind of say, we also want to do a bit of that. So, how do we do that together? How do we apply the moral imaginations approach to our specific context? A lot of organizations are waking up to the fact that they're going to have to change the way they lead, the way they operate as an organization in the next couple of years, in the next decades. They're seeing trends such as bringing nature into the organization, onto the board, regenerative design. The Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, they're seeing that there's some sort of movement, regenerative movement that's happening, and they want to understand how they can be part of that. We've worked with governments, local governments, with large corporations, multinational corporations, small companies, community organizations, and they're all slightly different. They're all looking for slightly different things. There's one aspect of this which is about training future leaders and senior leaders in these perspectives and approaches, the ability to consider future generations in decision making, or to consider how they can have a nature-centric form of governance or nature-centric strategy. But it's also about being able to vision the future, and actually be able to envision a future which is regenerative, which is net zero, or within the boundaries of the donut, within the planetary boundaries.
Now,
But then they're unable to, yeah.
yeah, you're going to have to say something about what are planetary boundaries and what do you mean by the donut, because not everybody is going to know that. So,
Yes, that's true. It's a lot of
yeah.
regenerative lingo that I'm just throwing around. So the planetary boundaries are from the Stockholm Resilience Center. Johan Rockström in 2009 set out the 9 planetary boundaries, these 9 dimensions of basically the carrying capacity of the planet that we need to stay within in order to be able to operate safely. And we've already passed 6 of them, and I believe we've either already passed the 7th, or we're on the cusp of passing the 7th of the 9 planetary boundaries. And the donut is a shorthand for donut economics, which is Kate Raworth's framework and book, under that title. And so what the donut does is take those 9 planetary boundaries and creates the outside of a circle, and then the inside of the circle is the kind of social, the boundary of social and economic kind of safety that we need to stay above. That wasn't very elegantly explained, but between those two things, you've got a donut.
2 connections. I mean, I've not seen Kate for years, but I remember meeting her at Schumacher before the book. It's when she was drawing the donut and working out how to describe it.
She was probably dreaming of the donut first.
It's a long, long time ago. And the other is Johan Rockström. He's speaking at Exeter. There's the Global System Science Conference in July, which I'm going to.
That's the Tim Lenton's conference.
Yes. Are you there?
I don't think so. I think I've got a clash, but I would love to. I met Tim at New York Climate Week earlier this year. I was part of a workshop that he was running on positive tipping points, which I thought was a really, really helpful frame, and connects into the work that we do around imagination activism. So helping people really see the positive possibilities of a future which exists within planetary boundaries. So that it was fantastic to see how his work has been evolving as well.
Yeah, so as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking of all kinds of connections that, of course, we have, and they're partly why I find your work so brilliant. I have a long history with appreciative inquiry and the power of positive stories. And this weekend coming, I'm going to Rob's workshop at Hawkwood, Rob Hopkins' workshop, with his new book, How to Fall in Love with the Future. A connection to that. But I imagine you've got a whole heap of kind of go-to influencers that you say, what formed Phoebe's work? And I think it might be really helpful for people listening to this to know something about how to
where it's come from.
Work, in that field.
Yeah, so I think we were starting to talk about this a couple of moments ago, but I probably got sidetracked by actually explaining what moral imaginations is. So the roots of moral imaginations, the roots are in ecology and my scientific background. So just after I had left Imperial College London, that's when I got to Schumacher College and started, part of what the questions that I was asking at the time was, but like one aspect of the questions that I was asking at the time was that science was showing, even at that time around 2014, sorry, it must have been 2016 when I left Imperial, was already seeing that science was telling a story about our interdependence with all of life. Symbiosis. I was doing research on bacteria and algae and their symbiotic interactions, and that led me down a research pathway of looking at the microbiome and understanding how much actually science was already showing us that the idea of there being an individual human being is a completely fabricated construct. And actually, we are interbeings and we are interrelated with the majority of cells in our body are made of bacteria. The microbiome actually influences our emotions and have correlations to depression and anxiety and different neurodivergences. So I was starting to see that science was telling us a story of who we are, and what our role is on this planet, but that was not being translated into the way we run society, the way we run organizations, education systems, and our economic system. It's just completely human centric, and short term. And when nature operates at these vast timescales, I think of the deep time walk, the method and tool created by Stefan Harding at Schumacher College. And so I was already starting to ask these sorts of questions. And around that time, I both went to Schumacher College, which had a huge influence on me. There are plenty of incredible teachers that pass through the college, including a lot of indigenous wisdom keepers and elders. So that, I was also exposed to the thinking of people such as Pat McCabe, who's a Lakota and Dene amazing leader. And around that time, I also discovered the work of Joanna Macy. So I was trained by Joanna, who is now a 96-year-old deep ecologist, Buddhist, activist and systems thinker. And I'd never heard of her before, but my childhood best friend actually clocked me onto her work. She said, Phoebe, this amazing elder and activist is running one of her final trainings this year. And even though you've never heard of her, all the things you talk about, she's doing. So I just feel like you have to be there. It's ecology, systems thinking, activism, Buddhism. And so I took a risk, I took a chance and went on one of her final 10-day trainings over in California. And that has hugely influenced my work. She really opened a portal into the power of imagination to actually help shift worldview, shift perspective, and the role of role play, the intersection of role play and imagination and systems thinking and moral activism and moral courage. That intersection runs just so deeply through the work of moral imaginations. And many of the practices and exercises that we work with are influenced by or adapted from some of Joanna's methodology. With her permission and with her blessing, a lot of what influenced me at the time was going through her training and methodology and starting to ask the question, hang on, what if this approach and methodology could be a bridge from what I was seeing of the bridge that needed to be created between the science, which was showing us this deep interdependence with life, and economic and governance systems. And another influence at the time was that I was in New Zealand in 2017 when the River Wanganui was given personhood, so given legal rights, recognized as a person. And I was lucky enough to spend some days with Maori leaders, people from the Wanganui iwi, the Wanganui tribe, and we got into discussions about how do you actually translate, a legal change such as giving a natural entity personhood, but how do you actually translate that into governance, economics, financial systems, organizations, and also into the consciousness and perspective of human beings? And so that also had a huge influence. So I've always been interested in how we influence culture so that we can influence structures. So it's that inner to outer transformation. The last set of influences I'll just mention is a lot of my early influences before going to Imperial, before going to Schumacher, were decolonial thinkers and people who are thinking a lot about how to decolonize education, like Paulo Freire was a really big influence, and Arturo Escobar and his approach to decolonizing design. And so those were also some early thinkers and writers who opened my eyes to the fact that actually our minds can be colonized by the systems that we're in, especially here in the West, in our weird Western educated rich, democratic. I always forget the I, but it's an acronym that stands for those five things, including an I. But that there is a kind of water that we swim in that can then be shifted and changed through theory, practice, and education.
Yeah, wonderful.
Hmm.
Know about your connection to the decolonial stuff at all? I've not heard you speak about that before. Um,
Ah,
yeah,
yes. There's a presentation that I give around the kind of genealogy of moral imaginations' work, and largely the buckets are deep ecology and systems thinking, decolonial thought, and indigenous cosmology. So those are the three,
oh,
um, influences of the work. And I stands for industrialized.
right. Yeah. So, um, one thing I will do, because I'm so keen that these podcasts are a connecting point for people to find you and find your work. Afterwards, I'll ask you to give a couple of links that people can find you by. So whether it's your
Mm,
site or favorite presentations you've done that people can get to find about your work, we'll provide a platform for them when we send this out.
very happy to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Hmm.
Thank
So,
you.
I mean, I was struck. I'm just earlier in this series last week. I was talking to Helen Shiroda, who's a game shift partner and a coach, who 30 odd years ago trained with Joanna Macy, and
Mm,
visions that training as being a pivot point in her work. And she then ran trainings with Joanna for a while. Um, and I just noticed how many of my connections, I've never worked with Joanna Macy at all, but I kind of feel like I have because of the, so many connections who
mm,
have worked with her. Yeah. And you mentioned
mm,
um, who sadly died last year. And
mm,
so many people have been influenced by his
mm,
both his teaching, his wonderful storytelling around science, um, and his deep time walks.
mhm,
So
mhm.
um, it's brilliant that we have these connections in common. I'd just like to kind of go back to your work again now and help people to understand. So, what does it look like? I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, so the work looks different in different contexts and scenarios, but one of the ingredients that is so important for helping people access and cultivate their moral imagination or expand their imagination in terms of how they think about the future is actually at the level of permission, more than anything else. Permission and also being able to see examples and kind of witness somebody who is giving them the sense of, psychological safety to think in bold and creative ways, in ways that actually push the edges of what's deemed possible. So a lot of the work is coming in and doing the culture shifting work of creating a space and a container where people feel welcome and yeah, psychologically safe to think in these expanded ways. The other is creating time and space. So actually creating protected time, protected space for people to exercise their imagination, their moral imagination. And then lastly, it's practice and tools. So actually equipping people with tools, with approaches and methodologies. Some of them we've created and developed, and others we draw on, the rich ecosystem of practices and tools that can help support people in different contexts to exercise radical imagination. It can look like giving a talk or a workshop or giving a really kind of inspiring input into a day or into a conference or into a workshop, but it can also look like longer term work. So the work that we've done with organizations such as Camden Council, that work took place over 2 years and really was an organizational transformation project. It looked like training internal change agents in imagination activism, then working with the leadership, creating an enabling environment for imagination, and also embedding imagination into some of the different departments of the council, housing or green spaces, or the policy team. So it also, the other thing to mention is that we've created tools and practices which are now rippling out and being used by people in their own context. I mean, that's the ideal thing, is actually equipping people with the approach, with the theory, with the practices in their own organizational context. So
So,
one of those, yeah,
so these are people who become imagination activists in
yes,
an organization or in society or whatever.
exactly. Exactly, and some of them get equipped with a tool called the Interspecies Council, which is a form of more than human governance. And so our approach to systems change, with a very limited, in terms of our size and our reach, it's really limited. So I'm always thinking carefully about how do we catalyze the most change possible with the smallest, the pebble in the pond that creates the ripples. And so rather than going on a campaign about the need for nature-centric governance and trying to convince everybody and getting that out in terms of communications and storytelling and campaigns. Rather, we created a tool, which is a more than human governance tool, which brings the perspective of nature into decision making, and we just started to popularize that. And we did a few high-profile projects. One of them was with DEFRA and the UK government over 2 years of that took 2 years to make happen. But essentially, we trialed this more than human citizen assembly tool with policymakers from DEFRA and a department of the UK government called Policy Lab, and wrote about it and got it out there. And that was enough as a kind of imagination catalyst to open the Overton window of what was actually seen as viable and possible. It's the kind of thing that you might have read in science fiction or in Starhawk's Fifth Sacred Thing, which is a really brilliant science fiction novel, which I love. And so it's the kind of thing you might have read about. Oh yeah, people represent the salamander or the snake or the otter or the salmon in decision making, but to actually then see policymakers doing that and experimenting with that as a form of policy making, that to me is how we start to shift the Overton window of what's actually acceptable and seen as something that could actually happen. Maybe in 10 years' time, we'll see these embedded within local democracy or within government, within the gold standard policymakers toolkit.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to see governments using these ideas, and I'd love to see universities making them commonplace. Because, as you know, my background for many years has been participative change, participative strategy, using action inquiry and extended epistemologies in organizational work. And everything you're saying makes perfect sense to me. And I think, yes, we need this. And just the other week, I was with a university doing a workshop on innovation and sustainability for a group of university leaders. It wasn't students, it was university leadership. And I just happened to put up some of the organizations, the names of organizations who've put nature, the ocean or nature or a river on their board. And there was not much conversation about it particularly, but in the feedback, people wrote, "Oh, this is just wacky. This is just, cookie ideas. Go away." Oh my God. The organizations that I would have expected, well, this is one, of course, just one organization, but I would have expected to be looking for the widest sense of how we change systems and how we play into the biggest issues we face. As a leadership team, actually has some of the smallest views I've seen in a long time. And that just makes me think, oh my God, your work is so necessary and I'd like to see it everywhere.
I mean, thank you. That's a lovely piece of feedback. I think it's it's always about meeting people where they're at and meeting the context that they are swimming in. So I think if you were to suddenly come across some of the examples of this work, it might seem completely bonkers. It might just seem really outside of the set of parameters of what looks like sustainability or what looks like systems change. When we look at the scale of the problems that we're facing, if you look at the trajectory that we're on, reaching 3 degrees by the end of the decade, if not before. What that, by 2050, we're set to have more plastic in the ocean than fish. When you actually look at the facts of where we are as a society, it becomes harder and harder to imagine that any kind of scale of response that doesn't seem absolutely ridiculous or really left field is actually going to cut it. So that's where I always come back to people who are sort of scratching their heads at some of this radical change. I think if you look at what has to change and the timescales that we've got to change it, if you actually just look at the numbers, the number of houses that we're going to have to build and the amount of time and space, and if you look at the actual material constraints, we're going to need shed loads of moral imagination in order to make that work. It's not going to work without wholesale systems change and a shift in worldview and a shift in how we design in a way that actually works for the whole.
Yeah.
So
we've got about 8 minutes or so left, and I'd just like to know something about, I know you're always innovating, so but what next for you and who inspires you? But maybe start with whichever of those who inspires your work now and what next for your work?
So I'm actually going to start with what next and then go on to who inspires me, if that's all right.
Sure.
What next is that over the last 4 to 5 years, we've had the pleasure of working with a whole range of different organizations and contexts, and we've learned a lot. There's been a lot of research and development. We're now seeing that there is a demand for this work. And so part of the question that we're asking now is, how do you actually meaningfully scale this work out in a way that can really continue to deliver the impact that we've seen, and not just become a sort of greenwash technique, like a tick box exercise. So that's a lot of what I'm thinking about. I'm also thinking about how to democratize the work and access to these kinds of tools and practices. If you're somebody living in the global majority, in global South countries, how do you actually get access to these sorts of tools and practices, and also what can we learn from some of the biggest kind of innovation in being imaginative and working with imagination and role play is coming from those places like Brazil or Colombia or Mexico or South Africa. So there's something here about scaling and about context and about how there's a lot of interest from some of those countries that I've just listed, people getting in touch with us and wanting to work with us. And what we're asking is, how do we actually work in deep partnership with people from very, very different cultures, from very different worldviews, who are already kind of thinking in these ways and who have been for generations and generations. How do we best honor indigenous worldviews and indigenous cultures who have been stewarding these ways of seeing the world as deeply interdependent and long term, and honoring future generations. And even within the rights of nature movement, like the River Wanganui being given personhood, or nature on the board. I mean, these are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been stewarded over thousands of years by indigenous cultures. So that's a long way round of just saying that I think some of the nuance that, some of the innovation to me is now understanding how to be culturally sensitive, honor the cultures and the roots of this way of thinking, but also be able to support and democratize, support at scale and democratize access to the work that we're doing and putting out there that people would like to have access to. So that's some of what I'm thinking about. The people that inspire me, as I say, I think the people that inspire me are the people who are doing this kind of radical boundary pushing innovative work in very experimental ways, but very under the, under the radar. They're not the people who are publishing books or necessarily speaking on stages, but who I'm coming across just through conversations, through starting to do a little bit of kind of mapping of the space as well. So um, I'm just thinking about, there are some really inspiring groups over in the US. There's a group called Change Elemental who has really been inspiring me, as well as a group called Wolf Willow Institute. And then there's some, fantastic kind of Maori futurism happening in New Zealand. I will find, I'll get links and kind of post them so that people can follow up with links and people who they might want to check out their work.
Yeah. And do you think you might ever write any of this down, or are you just too busy to do it?
I mean, there's a lot that's written online, but in terms of writing something like a handbook or a book, that's definitely on my on the things that need to happen. It's just a case of when does that happen, and when is it kind of priority compared to getting the work out.
No, I can just feel that in the in the way you're talking about it, because I can you're like a living library of all of this stuff and connections, and one way or another it's brilliant that it gets out. Whether it's a book or something else, I think is secondary.
Yeah, and a book it's a great way to to really concentrate thinking and pack the information into a form that can reach a lot of people. But it's also not the only way, and it's not the most accessible way either. So yeah.
Before we finish, I just have to mention somebody who, of course, was important to me, and I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning your granddad, because one of our first connections ever, I realised when I saw your name, was that you're related to Sir Crispin, who, when I was a very young civil servant in the Department of Energy, he was, I think, ambassador to the UN, or he definitely was instrumental in the very early days of climate policy globally. I can't remember exactly what his title was, but when I was in private office, I used to see his memos. And that was one of the instant connections when we first met, because I said, "Are you in any way related to?" And you said,
Yeah, it's my granddad, who sadly passed away 2 years ago. But yeah, what I loved about my granddad is that he was never afraid to go into places like the heart of government and bring incredibly radical thinking into those places. And so that's been a real inspiration to me. So he introduced Margaret Thatcher to James Lovelock's work and to Gaia theory, and she ended up being a huge fan of a little bit late in her career, unfortunately. Like, should have come a bit earlier, but towards the end of her career, she became really interested in Gaia theory and deep ecology and kind of Earth system science, which is kind of bizarre, because I wonder how that fit with her kind of there is no society, there's no such thing as society, and total denial of interdependence and interrelationships. But so he was one of the people early on who was ringing the alarm bell about climate, and trying to, he deeply cared about the planet and protecting Earth systems for all people and all of life. So yeah, lovely to
and it's
honor
wonderful
his memory.
that, yes, it's wonderful that we're talking about lineage in lots of ways. The connection to your granddad's work, the connection to Joanna Macy's work, the threads back into wisdom of all kinds of cultures, and it's incredibly rich and important, both that it's there and that we honour that it's there. So I'm delighted it's been so alive he said, karate chopping the microphone. I'm just delighted that it's so alive in this conversation.
Mm, mm. And I just want to add to that that, ancestry doesn't need to be limited to, blood, family ancestry. We are all ancestors. We are all descendants of this 3.6 billion year ancestor of nature. And that's where I derive the most enchantment and kind of wonder from, is this much longer lineage of life that we are just a small part of, and hopefully not the final chapter of, if we play our cards right.
Mm. Well, to quote Joanna Macy, at your age, you're 3.8 billion years old. Which
3.8, sorry, not 3.6.
yeah, yeah. Phoebe, I mean, we could go on forever. We could run a master's degree around all of this, but
One day I hope we do.
not today. Yeah, it's just so generous of you to do this in what I know is an incredibly packed day for you. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
And
It's such an honor to be part of your series, and our conversations have always been sources of inspiration and wisdom. So, just to mention that Chris has been somebody who has at different points kind of come in and accompanied the Moral Imagination's journey. So also just a huge amount of gratitude, and thanks to you, Chris, for all that you share, and all the people I know that you support, seen and unseen. So thank you.
And thank you. Phoebe, thank you very much. I'm just going to say a couple of words to close it off, then I'll come back to a final thanks to you. So thank you very much to anybody for listening to this About Time podcast. There will be, it will be posted along with the link shortly, and there'll be connections backwards and forwards to other podcasts that this relates to. So thank you very much. And once again, Phoebe, thank you so much for being here, and I hope the rest of the day goes really well.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks.